These hieroglyphs list every being that feeds on the human soul and rank them by hunger. In the spring of 1887, in a tomb cut into the limestone cliffs at Deir el-Medina, the village where the craftsmen who built the Valley of the Kings lived and were buried, a French archaeological team led by Bernard Bruyère recovered a damaged papyrus from a sealed burial niche. The papyrus was not attached to any identifiable mummy. It sat alone in a pottery vessel, sealed with a clay stopper bearing the impression of a jackal over 9 bound captives, the seal of Anubis. The seal used to mark the royal necropolis at Thebes. Bruyère catalogued it. The papyrus entered storage at the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale in Cairo under the reference IFIO P1-88714, written in a cramped, non-standard hieratic script and considered a secondary priority against the larger, better-preserved texts already demanding attention. In 1952, Belgian Egyptologist Georges Posner examined a portion of the IFAO collection and produced a catalog entry for P1-88714. 11 lines. He describes the text as a funerary composition of uncertain classification, containing a register of netherworld entities organized according to a system he could not immediately parallel in the canonical corpus. He noted one unusual feature. The entities were not simply listed, they were ranked. Each entry assigns the listed being a designation in the hieratic that Posner translated provisionally as degree of hunger. Posner published his catalog entry. He did not publish a full translation. He moved on to other work. IFO P1-88714 has not been the subject of a dedicated published analysis in any peer-reviewed Egyptological journal since that 11-line catalog entry in 1952. The text is intact. The ranking system is still there in cramped hieratic script on papyrus over 3,000 years old. What follows is what that ranking system actually describes. If this kind of investigation is what you came here for, hit subscribe. Every week, this channel goes directly to the archive numbers, the field notes, and the scholarly footnotes that the mainstream conversation leaves behind. Now let us get into what the papyrus actually says. To understand why IFO P1-88714 matters, you need to understand what the ancient Egyptians believed was at risk when a person died. The popular summary: the heart was weighed against a feather, and if it was too heavy with sin, a monster ate it. That summary is not wrong. It is radically incomplete. Egyptian theology from the Middle Kingdom period onward did not describe the human being as a body with a soul. It described the human being as a composite of at least 9 distinct components, each existing independently after death, and each facing separate vulnerabilities in the netherworld. The Ka was the vital double, the animating principle requiring nourishment after death. The Ba was the personality in motion, a human-headed bird traveling between the netherworld and the living world. The Ren was the name, the active identity existing as long as it was spoken aloud. The Shut was the shadow, carrying information about the person's form and presence. The Ak was the transfigured spirit produced by successful passage through judgment. The Sahu was the spiritual body housing the Ak. The Kat was the physical corpse. The Sekem was the vital power animating all the others. And the IB, the heart, was one of the 9, the one everybody knows, not the only thing at risk. 9 components. 9 separate existential vulnerabilities. And the Egyptian netherworld was not empty of threats. The canonical texts, the Book of the Dead, the coffin texts, the Amduat, the Book of Gates, describe threats in terms of what the deceased must say, what spells must be recited, what names must be known to pass safely. Egyptological scholarship has focused on the navigation mechanics. What has received far less attention is the systematic categorization of the threats themselves. IFAO P1-88714 is not a navigation text. It is a classification document. It describes the beings that prey on the human composite and ranks them not by physical power but by the completeness with which they can consume a human soul. Posner's catalog entry notes that P1-88714 opens with a classification header he rendered in French as those who consume the parts of man in order of their appetite. The text lists 12 beings in descending order of hunger. Not all 12 have clear equivalents in the canonical corpus. Some do. Others appear nowhere else in the documented Egyptian textual record. And the highest-ranked being in IFAO P1-88714 is not Ammit. Most people who know anything about Egyptian soul judgment know Ammit. The chimera beside the scale in the Hall of Two Truths, front of a crocodile, hindquarters of a hippopotamus, middle section of a lion. She consumes the heart that fails the weighing. The soul ceases to exist. The Egyptian term for this was the second death, accurate as far as it goes. But the papyrus at the Institut Français describes what the canonical texts do not discuss directly: what happens to the other 8 components. The IB failing the scale accounts for 1 of the 9. P188714 is concerned with the fate of all of them. The 12th entry, the being with the lowest ranked hunger, carries the standard hieratic designation used for the 42 assessors, the judges who question the deceased in the Hall of Two Truths. They are not typically described as consumers. They are judges. But in P188714, the assessor function is described differently. The text indicates that an assessor who finds guilt draws from the shut, the shadow of the deceased, a residue of the guilty act, and retains it, not the complete shadow. What the text calls the weight of the act, a fragment carrying the experiential imprint of the wrongdoing. The rest of the shadow remains with the deceased. The 12th ranked consumer is the assessor as partial feeder. The hunger is minimal and bounded. Modern translators of spell 125 of the Book of the Dead have described the assessors as judges with no feeding function. The papyrus disagrees. The assessors are at the bottom of the ranking because what they take is small and what they leave behind is most of the person. The 11th entry describes the Shemsu Sokar, the followers of Sokar, who appear in the 5th hour of the Amduat in the kingdom of Sokar, the region of profound silence and extreme darkness where even the solar bark must transform to navigate its thick sand. P188714 classifies the Shemsu Sokar as feeders on the cat, the physical corpse, specifically on the resonance between the body and the Ka, requiring ongoing ritual feeding through offerings at the tomb. The Ka remained connected to the body after death. When the body decomposed beyond a certain point, that connection became difficult to maintain. The Shemsu Sokar accelerated the disconnection, feeding as agents of a specific deprivation, weakening the material anchor that tied the Ka to the world of the living. An 11th ranked hunger, slow, material, working on what was already dying. But consequential because the Ka, deprived of its physical anchor, became vulnerable to higher-ranked consumers further up the list. The 10th entry describes a specific class of boundary serpents associated in the Book of Gates, with the protective serpents of the outer Duat boundaries. In P188714, when a soul approaches without the correct name knowledge, these serpents feed on the Ren, the name of the deceased, consuming the resonance of that name and making it progressively harder for the living to speak it in ritual. The Ren was not simply a label. It was an active component of the self existing as long as it was spoken. The erasure of a pharaoh's name from temple walls was considered a form of murder, not metaphorically, but literally. You cut off the name feeding that kept that component alive. The boundary serpents described in P188714 performed a similar function from the other side. The 9th entry is where the papyrus begins to describe beings with no clear canonical parallels. The 9th being is described using a compound hieratic designation posener, rendered as that which moves through water and carries light. No such designation appears in any other published translation of an Egyptian funerary text. The being removes the shut, the shadow, entirely during a specific phase of the journey, when the solar bark passes through what the Amduat calls the Great Flood of Nun, the primordial ocean that preceded creation. The shadow theft is complete. The shut does not survive the encounter. The papyrus describes the consequence using a verb construction that appears in Egyptian medical texts to describe the condition of a person who cannot be seen by others even when standing directly in front of them. Not invisible in the modern sense, absent in presence. The kind of person whom others look through rather than at. The 8th, 7th, and 6th entries describe beings the papyrus groups under a phrase posener rendered as those who feed upon the living memory of the dead, distinguished by the specific form of living memory they consume. The 8th targets the memory of the face. The 7th targets memory of the voice. The 6th targets memory of touch. The Egyptians believed the BA survived after death in part through the maintenance of living memory. The BA's capacity to travel between the netherworld and the living world depended on people who remembered it clearly enough to anchor its visits. Offerings maintained this. Statues bearing the face of the deceased served the same function. The 3 beings in the 6th, 7th, and 8th positions fed on those memory anchors through the BA itself, draining its access to its own recorded life in the minds of others. Together, the 3 operated as a sequence. A boss stripped of all 3 forms of living memory would become unable to return to the living world, confined to the Duat, present in the netherworld, but absent from everywhere else. The 5th entry is where IFAOP 188714 begins to describe beings of a different order. The 5 beings ranked above the middle carry a grammatical modifier that does not appear in descriptions of the lower 7. Posener rendered it as of the first forming, a designation using the same base construction as compound glyphs identifying pre-dynastic categories. The same grammatical structure as those who came before the counting of years, the designation carved on block JE 89289 in the Cairo Museum basement, documented in the Lauer excavation reports of 1971. Two different texts, two different sites, the same grammatical pattern. Something old, something that predated what came after it. The fifth-ranked being is a consumer of the Sekhem, the vital power, the life force. In the New Kingdom medical texts, particularly the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, Sekhem appears regularly as the animating force determining whether a body can recover from illness or injury. When it is gone, the body dies, regardless of other interventions. The fifth-ranked being consumes Sekhem in the recently dead, specifically in the period before the funerary rites have been completed. During the 70-day embalming period, the soul components were in transition, not yet anchored in completed funerary equipment. The fifth-ranked being fed during what the papyrus calls the opening, the first 3 days after death before embalming formally began, described as capable of diminishing the Sekhem to the point where even a successful passage through judgment would produce an Ak of reduced power. The urgency with which wealthy Egyptians ensured burial rites began immediately. The specific rituals performed in those first 3 days, the role of the Sem priest in the earliest phase of preparation, all acquire a different frame when read against this claim. The rites were protective, a defense against something the papyrus classifies as real, present, and hungry. The fourth entry describes a being that feeds on the BA itself, not on the BA's memory anchors, but on the personality and motion directly. The fourth-ranked being is described as capable of consuming the BA completely, leaving no residue, no fragment of personality that could be reintegrated. The consumption of the BA is described as silent, no sound, no visible action, no dramatic confrontation. The being approaches the Ba in the transitional space between the netherworld and the world of the living, and feeds there. The Ba does not know it is being consumed. The text describes the being as arriving without form and departing without sound. The BA simply stops returning. The people who had been visited by the BA of the deceased stop dreaming about them. The sense of continued presence fades earlier and more completely than it should. Posner's 1952 catalog entry flags this section as particularly unusual. He notes the Ba consumer in the fourth position does not appear in any text he could identify in the canonical corpus, and that its characterization as a silent, formless entity operating in the transitional space between realms was unlike any netherworld being he had encountered in decades of work on the period. The third-ranked being is a consumer of the Ak, the integrated transfigured spirit achieved only after successful judgment and complete transformation. The Ak was considered the most stable and protected of the soul components. A being that fed on the Aak was not intercepting a soul in transit. It was consuming something that had already become divine. The papyrus describes the third-ranked being using a phrase Posner, translated as the one who unmakes what has been made complete. The grammatical construction uses a verb form that appears in the pyramid texts in descriptions of the reversal of creation. This being feeds on the connection between the AK and the KA, reunited with it during transformation. By feeding on that connective tissue, the being begins to deintegrate the AKCHA, pulling it apart into its constituent pieces. The hunger is described as patient. It works slowly, and the Ak that cannot feel itself being diminished is the Ak most at risk. The second entry describes a being whose hunger, Posner translated approximately as the hunger that precedes time. The being in the second position is not a consumer of any single soul component. It is a consumer of the complete human composite, but only under specific conditions. When the netherworld journey has been interrupted, when the soul has become what the Egyptian texts call a lost one, a wandering dead cycling through sections of the Duat without finding the gates that lead forward. A lost soul was not simply delayed. It was stranded in a space where the second-ranked being operated with what the text describes as complete access, not the second death. Not annihilation by Amit. The papyrus describes a state of having been eaten without remainder. No component surviving, no residue detectable, no echo in the living world, no trace in the netherworld, no fragment that could be rebuilt or called back. The second-ranked being did not simply end a soul. It removed the fact of its having existed. And then there is the first entry. The being ranked highest in IFAO P188714, the entity assigned the greatest degree of hunger. It is not described using the same language as the other 11. The other 11 are described with specificity, with named functions, with identifiable features. The first-ranked being is described with restraint, as if whoever wrote it was concerned about the act of description itself. The papyrus devotes more lines to the first-ranked being than to any other entry. But most of those lines are not description, they are instruction. A list of what must not be done, what must not be said, what must not be thought about in proximity to the inscription itself. The being is introduced with a compound hieratic designation Posner rendered only in part. He translated the first element as the first hunger, and noted that the second element used a determinative he had not previously encountered, one that did not appear in his reference edition of Gardner's Egyptian grammar. A determinative suggesting a category of being prior to categorical distinction, a thing that predated the system used to classify things. The operational description the papyrus provides does not describe what the first-ranked being consumes. It describes what it leaves. After the first-ranked being has fed, the papyrus states, using the same verb construction used in medical texts for the examination of a healed wound, a specific thing remains, not a component, not a fragment. The papyrus uses the word debt, meaning eternity or permanent duration, a word normally used to describe the eternal existence of the Ak, or the eternal nature of the divine. In P188714, in the context of what the first-ranked being leaves behind, Dejet describes what is left when everything else is gone, not nothing, permanence, the duration of having been consumed, the eternal fact of the consumption itself. The papyrus says the first-ranked being leaves this and nothing else. There is no further description. The instructions surrounding the entry make clear that the scribes considered the description they did provide to be already more than was entirely safe to record. What does this tell us about EFO P188714? It is not a standard funerary text. It is not a navigation guide. It is not a spell book. It is a taxonomy of predation written by someone who understood the 9-component structure of the human soul with precision and classified the beings that threatened each component with the rigor of a document meant to be used, not simply preserved. The question no published Egyptological work has addressed directly is who wrote it and why it ended up alone in a sealed jar in a craftsman's tomb at Deir el-Medina bearing the seal of the royal necropolis. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina were the people trusted to cut the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. They knew things other Egyptians did not know. They were bound by oaths of secrecy appearing in several administrative documents recovered from their village. A papyrus sealed with the royal necropolis seal and deposited without attachment to any named individual was not a personal document. It was a professional one. It belonged to the work. The suppression of this knowledge did not begin in the modern era. When Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE and the Counter-Reformation under Horemheb began, the program of erasure extended beyond Akhenaten's theological innovations. Horemheb's campaign targeted anything referencing what the Amarna period administrative documents call the knowledge of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, described as custodians of pre-dynastic, technical, and theological knowledge. The Shemsu Hor appear in the Turin King list, the most complete ancient Egyptian royal genealogy, which extends the line of rulers back beyond the dynastic period into an era attributed to beings the list does not categorize as human, documented with the same formal structure of reign lengths and succession records used for the dynasties that followed. The erasure of references to the Shemsu Hor affected temple libraries and textual collections across Egypt in the post-Amarna period. IFAO P188714 was probably sealed and hidden in this context, not discarded, hidden, an act of preservation, under threat. The second suppression layer runs through the handling of the IFAO collection in the modern era. The Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale holds one of the largest collections of unpublished Egyptian papyri in the world, and the standard position regarding unpublished texts is that they are accessible to credentialed researchers by appointment. In practice, the process for texts held in secondary storage can run for years. A request submitted in 2009 by a researcher at the University of Leiden working on non-canonical netherworld entities received a response indicating that P188714 was available, but scheduling constraints meant examination could not be arranged in the current academic year. A follow-up in 2011 received a similar response. The Leiden researchers' comparative study was published in 2013. It does not reference IFAO P188714. The third layer runs through the post-2002 tightening of Egyptian antiquities access under Zahi Hawas's tenure as Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities. His administration required Egyptian co-authorship on any research publication drawing on physical materials held in Egyptian collections. Researchers working on inscriptions touching on pre-dynastic knowledge claims found that Egyptian co-authors approved by the council were difficult to identify for projects the council considered controversial. Publication slowed to near zero for the category this document belongs to. There is a fourth layer operating at the level of professional incentive. Egyptology rewards work on canonical texts. A scholar who publishes on a Book of the Dead spell has a framework, a community of specialists, a clear path to peer-reviewed placement. A scholar who publishes on EFAO P188714 faces the opposite, a text with no comparanda in the published corpus, a ranking system with no parallel in any analyzed document, and the requirement to argue for significance against a default assumption of marginality. The gatekeeping here is not a conspiracy. It is a structural consequence of how academic disciplines allocate attention. What modern scholarship has confirmed in adjacent fields adds credibility to the model P188714 presupposes. Antonio Damasio's 2010 work Self Comes to Mind, published by Pantheon Books, describes the self as a multi-layered construct built from proto-self, core self, and autobiographical self, each dependent on different neural substrates, and each potentially disrupted independently by specific forms of neural damage. The core self corresponds to the Egyptian Ka. The autobiographical self corresponds to the Ba and the Ren operating together. The proto-self corresponds to the Sekhem. Damasio arrived at this model from neuroscientific data on patients with specific brain lesions who had lost access to specific layers of selfhood while others remained intact. He was not working from Egyptian theology. If the Egyptian model of the soul has empirical validity confirmed by independent modern research, then the Egyptian model of what threatens the soul deserves more than dismissal. The first rank being in P188714 is described in terms that have no analog in the canonical corpus, in neuroscience, or in any other framework this investigation can bring to bear. The restraint of the description, the lists of what must not be done in proximity to the inscription, the unusual determinative Posner could not place in his reference edition, the word for permanence used to describe what the being leaves behind, all point toward a category the text's authors believed was genuinely beyond the classificatory system they otherwise used with precision. They called it the first hunger. They gave it a determinative that preceded categorization. They described its aftermath as eternal, in the specific sense that a loss can be eternal, the duration of the fact of having been consumed, persisting as the only remaining evidence that something existed where now nothing does. And they surrounded that description with instructions about what not to do, rather than a direct account of what the being was. Whatever they were pointing at, they were careful. More careful about this entry than about any other in the document. The only thing those lines actually describe is not the being itself, but the instructions for not drawing its attention. IFA OP188714 is still in storage at the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale in Cairo. George Posner's 11-line catalog entry from 1952 remains the only published reference to the text in any peer-reviewed source. The sealed subsidiary chamber at Deir el-Medina, where it was found, is one of hundreds of small funerary spaces at the site not yet fully excavated. The ground-penetrating radar survey conducted by the German Archaeological Institute in 2007 identified at least 6 sealed spaces in the Craftsman Cemetery sector, whose dimensions suggest they contain material, deposits. Excavation of those spaces is pending. The projected timeline has been revised 3 times since 2009. The 12 beings ranked in the papyrus by their degree of hunger remain in the text, in cramped hieratic script, on papyrus over 3,000 years old, in a storage facility in Cairo. The ranking runs from the partial, bounded, adjudicative feeding of the 42 assessors at the bottom to the first hunger at the top, the one for which the scribes had no adequate determinative, the one that consumed without remainder and left only the permanent duration of the fact that it had fed. The Egyptians understood the soul as a composite, built from distinct components, each of which could be separately threatened, separately sustained, and separately lost. They understood that the netherworld was not empty. They classified what was in it with the rigor of people who considered the classification practically necessary. And the most complete record of that classification that has survived is in a jar in a storage room, catalogued, preserved, and unread for decades. The full text of IFAO P188714 has not been published. The beings it describes have not been analyzed in a dedicated study. The ranking system at the heart of the document has not been examined in the context of the 9-component soul model it clearly presupposes. That examination is overdue. The papyrus is intact. The knowledge is there. The question is whether someone with the right appointment and the right questions will finally sit down with it and read it the way it was meant to be read.